The morning air carried a chill that made Margaret Wilson pull her worn cardigan tighter around her shoulders. She sat on the concrete steps outside Riverside Apartments, a faded building that had seen better days, with her old acoustic guitar resting across her lap. The instrument had scratches and dents from years of use, but it still held a warm, rich tone that made her smile every time she played it. Margaret was 72 years old, with silver hair that she kept in a simple bun and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. She had moved to this neighborhood 6 months ago after her husband passed away, leaving behind the house they had shared for 40 years. The apartment was small and the neighborhood was rough around the edges, but the rent was all she could afford on her limited pension. She began to strum a gentle melody, something she remembered from her childhood. The notes floated through the quiet morning, a simple folk tune her mother used to sing. Margaret didn't play for anyone in particular. She just played because music had always been her comfort, her way of dealing with loneliness and grief. Across the courtyard, 10-year-old Marcus Thompson paused on his way to school. He had been running late as usual, his backpack hanging off one shoulder, but something about the music made him stop. He had never heard anything quite like it in this neighborhood. The sound was different from the loud bass that usually thumped from car stereos or the shouting that often echoed between the buildings. Marcus stood there for a moment, listening. His mother worked 2 jobs and was rarely home, and his older brother had gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd. Music like this reminded him of something peaceful, something safe. He didn't approach Margaret that first morning. He just listened from a distance, then hurried off to school with the melody stuck in his head. Margaret noticed the boy but didn't call out to him. She simply continued playing, her fingers moving across the strings with practiced ease. She played for another 20 minutes before heading back inside, unaware that she had just planted the first seed of something beautiful. The next morning, Margaret returned to the same spot at the same time. She had developed a routine of playing for an hour each morning before the day grew too warm or too busy. As she settled onto the steps and began another tune, she noticed Marcus again. This time he stood a little closer, his curiosity winning over his shyness. "That's pretty," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely audible over the music. Margaret looked up and smiled. "Thank you, sweetheart. Do you like music?" Marcus nodded. "My grandma used to sing, but she died last year." "I'm sorry to hear that," Margaret said gently. "What kind of songs did she sing?" "Church songs mostly, and some old songs I don't know the names of." Margaret's fingers never stopped moving across the strings as she talked. "Those old songs are the best ones. They carry memories with them." She shifted into a hymn she thought he might recognize, and Marcus's face lit up. "I know that one," he exclaimed. "Amazing Grace!" "Would you like to sit and listen for a while?" Margaret asked. "I promise I won't make you late for school." Marcus hesitated, then sat down on the bottom step a few feet away from her. Margaret played through several more songs, some with words, some without. She told him the stories behind a few of them, about where she learned them and who had taught her to play. When it was time for Marcus to leave for school, he thanked her and ran off. But the next morning he was back. And the morning after that. Each day he would sit a little closer, ask a few more questions, and stay a little longer by the end of the second week. Other people had started to notice. Mrs. Chun from apartment 3B would open her window to listen while she prepared breakfast. Mr. Rodriguez, who worked nights as a security guard, would pause before going inside after his shift to hear a song or two. Even some of the teenagers who usually loitered near the parking lot would turn down their music when Margaret started playing. Margaret never performed for an audience. She simply played for herself, sharing her music with anyone who wanted to listen. She didn't know most of her neighbors' names yet, and they didn't know much about her either. But the music was creating invisible threads between them, connecting strangers through shared moments of peace. One morning, as Margaret finished a particularly beautiful rendition of Shenandoah, a woman approached her. She was in her mid-30s, wearing scrubs that suggested she worked in healthcare. Her face looked tired, but her eyes were warm. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the woman said. "I'm Marcus's mother, Denise. I wanted to thank you for being so kind to my son. He talks about you all the time. Says you're teaching him about music." Margaret shook her head modestly. "I'm not teaching him anything formal. We just talk and I play. He's a wonderful boy." "He is," Denise agreed, her voice thick with emotion. But things have been hard since his grandmother passed. His brother's been in trouble, and I'm working so much I barely see them. When Marcus comes home talking about your songs and the stories you tell, it's the first time in months I've seen him excited about something positive. He's welcome to listen anytime, Margaret said. It's nice to have company. Denise thanked her again and hurried off to work, but that conversation stayed with Margaret throughout the day. She had been so focused on her own loneliness that she hadn't fully realized how much these simple morning concerts might mean to others. She was just playing music, but somehow, in this small way, she was making a difference. The morning concerts became a fixture at Riverside Apartments. Margaret arrived each day at 8 o'clock sharp, guitar in hand, and would play until 9. The audience grew slowly but steadily. What started with just Marcus had expanded to include a handful of regular listeners who arranged their morning routines around her music. Mrs. Chun started bringing her tea outside. Sitting on a folding chair she placed near her ground floor window, Mr. Rodriguez would lean against the wall, eyes closed, letting the music wash away the stress of his night shift. A young couple from the second floor, newlyweds named Jamie and Alexis, would sit on their balcony, hands intertwined, listening before they left for work. Margaret learned their names gradually, through small conversations before and after her playing. She discovered that Mrs. Chen had immigrated from Taiwan 40 years ago and still missed the songs of her homeland. She learned that Mr. Rodriguez had once played trumpet in his high school band, but hadn't touched an instrument in 20 years. The newlyweds told her they couldn't afford a fancy wedding, so they had gotten married at City Hall. And her music reminded them of the simple joy they felt that day. 3 weeks into her morning routine, something unexpected happened. Marcus showed up with a notebook and a pencil. "Miss Margaret," he said shyly, "could you teach me to write down music? My music teacher at school says I have a good voice, but I don't know how to remember the songs I make up in my head." Margaret was touched. "Well, I'm not trained in formal music theory, but I can show you what I know. Bring that notebook here." She spent that morning teaching Marcus the basics of how she remembered melodies, using simple notation she had developed over the years. It wasn't professional, but it worked for her. Marcus absorbed everything like a sponge, his pencil scratching across the paper as he tried to capture the tune she was playing. Mrs. Chen watched this interaction with interest. The next morning, she approached Margaret with a request of her own. "My granddaughter is coming to visit next month," Mrs. Chen said in her accented English. "She lives in California. I want to learn an American song to sing to her, something that shows I understand her world. Can you help?" Margaret beamed. "Of course. What kind of song were you thinking?" Together they settled on "You Are My Sunshine," a simple melody with sweet lyrics. Mrs. Chun's voice was thin and wavering, but she practiced diligently each morning, singing along softly as Margaret played. The other listeners would smile as they heard Mrs. Chun's progress, her confidence growing with each day. Mr. Rodriguez was next. He showed up one morning with a battered trumpet case. "I found this in my closet," he admitted, looking almost embarrassed. "Haven't played in forever. Probably sounds terrible now, but listening to you every morning made me think maybe I could try again." "Music isn't about being perfect," Margaret told him gently. "It's about expression, about joy. Play what makes you happy." So Mr. Rodriguez began to join in, his trumpet rusty at first but improving as his muscle memory returned. The combination of guitar and trumpet added a new dimension to the morning concerts. Sometimes they played together, sometimes they took turns, and sometimes they just experimented with harmonies and rhythms. The music was changing the atmosphere of Riverside Apartments in subtle but significant ways. People who had lived there for years without knowing each other's names were starting to connect. Neighbors would stop to chat after Margaret's concerts, sharing stories and laughter. The courtyard, which had previously been a space people hurried through to get to their apartments, was becoming a gathering place, but not everyone was pleased with the changes. Derek Williams had lived at Riverside for 5 years and had built a reputation as someone who kept to himself and liked it that way. He was in his early 40s, worked from home as a freelance programmer, and valued his quiet. The morning music sessions were disrupting his concentration, and after 2 weeks of trying to ignore it, he had had enough. One morning, he stormed down from his third-floor apartment and confronted Margaret just as she was tuning her guitar. Look Lady, I don't know who you think you are. But some of us are trying to work, Derek said angrily. Your little concert series is making it impossible for me to concentrate. There are noise ordinances, you know. The small crowd that had gathered fell silent. Margaret looked up at Derek calmly, her hands stilling on the guitar strings. I apologize if I've been disturbing you, she said sincerely. I didn't realize the music was carrying up that far. What time would be better for you? Derek was taken aback by her gentle response. He had expected an argument, not an apology. I work from 8 to 5 most days. I need quiet. That's my only free time in the morning, Margaret explained. My daughter calls at 9:30 and I have doctor's appointments most afternoons. But perhaps we could find a compromise. Mrs. Chen spoke up. The courtyard is a shared space. Many of us enjoy the music. And I need to work, Derek shot back. My deadlines don't care about community concerts. Marcus, who had been watching the exchange with worried eyes, said quietly, My teacher says music helps people think better. Maybe it could help you work? Derek looked at the boy, then at Margaret, then at the small group of people who had become regulars at these morning sessions. He saw hope in their faces, a light that hadn't been there before. But he also felt frustrated that his needs were being overlooked. I'll tell you what, Margaret said thoughtfully. What if we tried something different? I could play quieter, maybe move to the other side of the courtyard, farther from your window. And if that doesn't work, we can talk again and figure out another solution. I don't want to make your life harder, Derek. The use of his name, which she must have learned from the mailboxes, softened something in Derek's expression. People in this building rarely knew each other's names, rarely cared enough to learn them. Fine, he said after a moment. Try the other side. But if I can still hear it through my walls, we're going to have a problem. He turned and walked back to his apartment, leaving an awkward silence in his wake. Margaret simply smiled at the remaining group and moved to a bench on the opposite side of the courtyard. The acoustics were slightly different there, but it would work. Don't let him bother you, Miss Margaret, Mr. Rodriguez said. Some people just don't appreciate beautiful things. Oh, I'm not bothered, Margaret replied, settling onto the bench. Everyone has different needs and different struggles. We just have to find a way to live together. Now, what should we play this morning? As she began to strum a gentle melody, she noticed Derek's window on the 3rd floor. The curtain moved slightly, and she could have sworn she saw him watching, though he didn't come back down. Moving to the other side of the courtyard changed the dynamics of the morning sessions in ways Margaret hadn't anticipated. The new location was closer to the street, which meant passers-by could hear the music more clearly. Within days, people who didn't even live at Riverside Apartments started stopping to listen. There was Thomas, a mail carrier who adjusted his route to coincide with Margaret's playing time. He would sit on the low wall bordering the property, sorting mail while humming along to familiar tunes. Sarah, a nurse who worked at the hospital 3 blocks away, would pause during her walk to her car, standing quietly for a few minutes before her shift, letting the music prepare her for the difficult day ahead. Even some of the local shop owners began to notice. The woman who ran the corner bakery, Rosa, started timing her morning bread delivery to Riverside so she could catch at least one song. She told Margaret that the music reminded her of her village in Mexico, where people would gather in the town square each evening to share songs and stories. Marcus continued to be Margaret's most devoted student. His notebook was filling up with lyrics and melody lines, his own creative attempts at songwriting mixing with the traditional tunes Margaret taught him. His grades at school had improved too. His mother, Denise, mentioned to Margaret that his teachers had noticed a change in his attitude. He was more focused, more confident, more willing to participate in class. Whatever you're doing, Denise said one morning, her eyes grateful and tired, it's working. His brother is still struggling. But seeing Marcus do well gives me hope. Mrs. Chen had mastered You Are My Sunshine and had moved on to learning What a Wonderful World. Her voice was growing stronger with practice, and she had started singing to herself while doing her morning Tai Chi exercises in the courtyard. Other residents would smile when they heard her, the familiar melody becoming part of the apartment's daily rhythm. Mr. Rodriguez's trumpet playing had improved dramatically. He and Margaret had developed a real musical partnership, able to anticipate each other's choices and create spontaneous harmonies. They had expanded their repertoire to include jazz standards, old country songs, and even some pop classics that Mr. Rodriguez remembered from his youth. The transformation of Riverside Apartments was becoming visible in other ways too. The courtyard, which had been littered with cigarette butts and forgotten trash, was cleaner now. Residents had started taking pride in their shared space. Someone had planted flowers in the neglected beds near the entrance. Someone else had repaired the broken bench that had been lying on its side for months. People were greeting each other in the hallways, holding doors open, sharing vegetables from small balcony gardens. The building felt less like a collection of isolated units and more like an actual community. And at the center of it all was Margaret and her guitar, creating a daily ritual that brought people together. But Derek remained a holdout. He still didn't come down for the morning concerts, though Margaret sometimes caught glimpses of him watching from his window. He never complained again about the noise, which Margaret took as a good sign. But he also never joined the growing community forming in the courtyard. 4 weeks after the confrontation with Derek, something happened that would change everything. It was a Thursday morning, and Margaret had just started playing when she heard shouting from inside the building. Marcus, who had been sitting beside her, jumped up with a worried look on his face. "That's my brother," he said. Fear evident in his voice, the shouting grew louder, and suddenly Marcus's older brother Jason burst through the door into the courtyard. He was 17, tall and angry, with tear tracks on his face. Behind him came Denise, still in her work scrubs, clearly distraught. "You can't keep treating me like a kid." Jason yelled at his mother. "I'm not Marcus. I'm not going to sit around singing songs and pretending everything's fine. I just want you to stay in school." Denise cried. "I want you to have a future. School doesn't matter. Nothing matters in this place." Jason swept his arm around the courtyard. "Look at where we live. What's the point?" The morning concert audience sat frozen, unsure whether to leave or stay. Margaret's hands stilled on her guitar. Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear. Jason noticed the crowd for the first time and laughed bitterly. "Oh, perfect. An audience. Are you all here for the show? Come to watch the broken family fall apart?" "Jason, please," Denise pleaded, reaching for her son's arm. He pulled away and turned to leave. But then Derek's voice cut through the tension from above. "Hold on," Derek called from his third-floor balcony. Everyone looked up in surprise. Derek never involved himself in anything related to the community. Derek came down the stairs, moving quickly but deliberately. When he reached the courtyard, he walked straight to Jason. "I don't know you," Derek said, "and you don't know me. But I know what it's like to feel trapped, to feel like nothing you do matters." Jason stared at him suspiciously. "Yeah? And what? You're going to tell me it gets better? That I should just try harder?" "No," Derek said. "I'm going to tell you that I moved into this building 5 years ago after my wife left me and I lost my job. I was so depressed I barely left my apartment for 6 months. I rebuilt my career working freelance because I couldn't face going back into an office. I've been hiding up in that apartment, avoiding people, avoiding life, because it felt safer than trying again." The courtyard was completely silent now. Even Jason seemed taken aback by Derek's honesty. "Then this woman showed up with her guitar," Derek continued, gesturing to Margaret. "And she started playing every morning. And it annoyed me because it reminded me that there was a world outside my apartment, outside my comfortable isolation. I tried to make her stop, but she wouldn't. She just moved and kept playing." Derek paused, his voice catching slightly. "And every morning, whether I wanted to or not, I could hear that music. I could hear people laughing and talking down here. I could hear community happening. And it made me realize that I've been wasting 5 years of my life being angry and scared." He looked directly at Jason. "So no, I'm not going to tell you it gets better. I'm going to tell you that you get to choose. You can let this place define you, or you can define yourself. You can push everyone away, or you can let them in. Neither choice is easy, but one of them leads somewhere, and the other one just leads to more anger." Jason's defensive posture had softened slightly. "Why do you care what I do?" "Because I don't want you to waste 17 years like I wasted 5, Derek said simply. "Because your mother clearly loves you and your brother looks up to you. And because everyone in this courtyard would probably support you if you gave them half a chance." Denise was crying openly now, but they were different tears than before. Margaret felt her own eyes welling up. Jason looked around at the gathered crowd. At his mother, at Marcus, at Margaret with her guitar. "I don't even know how to start," he admitted quietly, the anger draining from his voice, leaving only exhaustion and confusion. Margaret stood up, setting her guitar gently on the bench. She walked over to Jason with the same calm kindness she showed everyone. "You start by sitting down," she said softly. "You start by listening. You start by letting yourself be part of something instead of fighting against everything." Jason hesitated, then slowly sank down onto the ground where he stood, his back against the wall of the building. His mother sat beside him, not saying anything, just being there. Marcus, after a moment's uncertainty, sat on his brother's other side. Derek remained standing for a moment, looking uncomfortable with the emotional scene he'd helped create. Then Mr. Rodriguez pulled up a chair and gestured for him to sit. Derek did, and for the first time in 5 years, he became part of the morning gathering. Margaret returned to her bench and picked up her guitar. "I think," she said gently, "that we could all use some music right now." She began to play a song she had learned during her own difficult times, after her husband died and she felt lost and alone. It was a song about resilience, about finding light in dark places, about the strength it takes to keep going when everything feels broken. She didn't sing the words, just let the melody speak for itself. As she played, the tension in the courtyard slowly dissolved. People began to breathe more easily. Jason leaned his head back against the wall, eyes closed, his breathing gradually becoming calmer. Denise held his hand and Marcus leaned against his brother's shoulder. When Margaret finished that song, she moved into another, then another. She played for longer than usual that morning, sensing that the music was doing important work, creating a space where healing could begin. After the final notes faded, Derek was the first to speak. "I'm Derek Williams, apartment 3C, he said to the group. "And I think I owe everyone an apology for being a jerk about the music." "You weren't a jerk," Mrs. Chun said kindly. "You were honest about your needs. That's important too." Derek smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually stern face. "Well, I'm done hiding upstairs. If there's room in this group for one more, I'd like to join." "There's always room," Margaret assured him. Over the next few days, the morning concerts took on a new energy. Derek became a regular attendee, often bringing coffee for Margaret and whoever else wanted some. He started talking to people, learning their stories, sharing bits of his own life. The programmer who had isolated himself for 5 years was slowly reconnecting with humanity. Jason's transformation was slower but no less significant. He started showing up to the morning concerts, usually standing at the edge of the group, arms crossed, listening but not participating. Denise didn't push him. She just made sure he knew he was welcome and let him come to things in his own time. It was Marcus who finally drew Jason deeper into the community. One morning, Marcus proudly showed everyone a song he had written, his first complete composition. It was a simple melody with lyrics about brotherhood and second chances. When he finished playing it on Margaret's guitar, his hands shaking with nervousness, everyone applauded. "That was for you," Marcus said quietly to Jason. "Because I believe in you even when you don't believe in yourself." Jason's eyes filled with tears. He pulled his little brother into a hug, and when they separated, he asked Margaret, "Could you teach me too? I don't know anything about music, but I'd like to learn." "Of course," Margaret said warmly. "Music belongs to everyone who wants it." The dynamic at Riverside Apartments continued to evolve. The morning concerts expanded to include impromptu jam sessions where anyone could contribute. Mrs. Chun would sing. Mr. Rodriguez would play his trumpet. Derek, it turned out, had a decent singing voice and knew the lyrics to dozens of old folk songs. Jamie and Alexis started bringing percussion instruments, shakers and tambourines that added rhythm to the mix. Jason proved to be a natural musician. He had a good ear and picked up guitar chords quickly. Margaret spent extra time with him in the afternoons, teaching him what she knew. She learned that he had dropped out of school not because he didn't care about his future, but because he felt overwhelmed by the pressure to succeed with no clear path forward. "My mom works so hard," Jason confided one afternoon. "She's killing herself to give us opportunities, and I feel like I'm just wasting everything she's sacrificing for." "You're 17, Margaret reminded him gently. "You're allowed to not have everything figured out. Your mother doesn't need you to be perfect. She needs you to try to stay open to possibilities." to not give up on yourself. With encouragement from Margaret and others in the community, Jason started attending GED classes at the community center 3 blocks away. It wasn't easy, and there were days when he wanted to quit. But the morning concerts gave him something to look forward to. A reminder that there were people who believed in him. The changes at Riverside Apartments hadn't gone unnoticed by the property management company. The building supervisor, a gruff man named Carl, who had worked there for 15 years, approached Margaret one morning with a proposition. "I've been watching what you've done here," Carl said, his tone respectful despite his rough appearance. "This building was going downhill. We were losing tenants, having trouble filling vacancies. Now people are staying, taking care of the place. Corporate wants to know if you'd be willing to organize an official community event, maybe once a month. They'll provide some funding for refreshments, supplies, whatever you need." Margaret was surprised and pleased. "I'd be happy to, but I think this should be a community decision, not just mine." So at the next morning concert, Margaret presented the offer to the group. The response was enthusiastic. Ideas started flowing immediately. Mrs. Chun suggested monthly potluck dinners, where everyone could share food from their cultures. Derek proposed a community garden in the unused strip of land behind the building. Mr. Rodriguez wanted to organize a talent show to showcase everyone's abilities. They decided to start with a community picnic, to be held on a Saturday afternoon in 3 weeks. Everyone would contribute something, whether it was food, decorations, entertainment, or help with setup and cleanup. It would be a celebration of how far they'd come and an invitation to other residents who hadn't yet joined the morning concerts. The planning process itself brought people together in new ways. Denise, who worked in healthcare, organized a health screening booth for the picnic. Derek used his tech skills to create flyers and a simple website for the community. Rosa from the bakery donated bread and pastries. Thomas, the mail carrier, helped spread the word throughout the neighborhood. As the day of the picnic approached, Margaret felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had come to Riverside Apartments 6 months ago as a lonely widow, looking for an affordable place to live out her remaining years. She had never imagined that simply playing her guitar each morning would spark such profound changes, but she also knew that the music itself wasn't really what had transformed the community. Music had been the catalyst, the excuse for people to gather, but it was the connections they formed, the kindness they showed each other, and the courage they found to be vulnerable that had created something beautiful. The Saturday of the community picnic arrived with perfect weather. The sun was warm but not too hot, and a gentle breeze kept the air comfortable. The courtyard at Riverside Apartments had been transformed. Colorful tablecloths covered folding tables borrowed from the community center. String lights had been hung between the buildings, waiting to be turned on as evening approached. A small stage area had been set up with microphones and speakers that Derek had somehow managed to acquire and set up. People started arriving early, carrying dishes covered in foil and plastic wrap. Mrs. Chun brought homemade dumplings and a large pot of fried rice. Rosa from the bakery contributed several trays of sweet bread and cookies. Denise made her grandmother's famous potato salad and barbecued chicken. Derek, who claimed he couldn't cook, showed up with pizzas from the local parlor and several cases of soda, but it wasn't just the regular morning concert attendees who came. Other residents of Riverside Apartments, people who had watched the growing community from a distance, started to emerge from their apartments. There was the elderly couple from 2D who rarely left their unit. The single father from 1A with his 3 young children. The college student from the top floor, who worked nights and usually slept during the day. Even people from the surrounding neighborhood showed up. Thomas, the mail carrier, came with his wife and daughter. Sarah, the nurse, brought her girlfriend. Families from nearby buildings, drawn by the flyers Derek had posted around the area, came to see what this community celebration was all about. Margaret stood near the entrance, greeting people as they arrived, directing them to where they could put their food contributions. She wore a floral dress that had been her favorite for special occasions, and her guitar was never far from her side. "I can't believe how many people came," she said to Derek, who was helping organize the food tables. "You started something special," Derek replied. People are hungry for connection. They just needed someone to show them it was possible. The picnic officially began at noon with Margaret playing the national anthem. Everyone stood, hands over hearts, united in that moment regardless of their backgrounds or circumstances. It was a powerful beginning. The afternoon unfolded with music, food, games, and laughter. Mr. Rodriguez's mariachi band, which he hadn't mentioned until that morning, performed a set of energetic songs that had everyone clapping and dancing. Mrs. Chen sang, "You Are My Sunshine" to her granddaughter, who had flown in from California for the event. And there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. Marcus performed the song he had written about brotherhood. And this time he sang the lyrics confidently, his voice clear and strong. Jason stood beside his brother, playing guitar, the pride on his face evident. When they finished, the applause was thunderous. The children played games on the lawn while adults talked and ate and listened to music. The elderly couple from 2D, Ruth and Harold, told stories about what the neighborhood had been like 50 years ago when they first moved in. The college student, whose name was Alina, performed a stunning spoken word piece about finding home in unexpected places. As the afternoon wore on, something remarkable happened. People who had never spoken to each other before were having real conversations. They were sharing their stories, their struggles, their hopes. The barriers that typically separated neighbors were falling away, replaced by genuine curiosity and compassion. The health screening booth that Denise had organized turned out to be incredibly valuable. Several people discovered they had high blood pressure and were referred to the free clinic downtown. An elderly man learned he needed glasses, and Derek immediately started researching programs that could help him get them affordably. The sense of community care extended beyond just social connection into practical support. As evening approached and the string lights came on, casting a warm glow over the gathering, Carl, the building supervisor, took the microphone. "I've worked at Riverside Apartments for 15 years, he said. His usually gruff voice softened with emotion. "I've seen this place at its worst, seen it nearly condemned, seen it become a place people were ashamed to call home. But in the last few months, I've watched something incredible happen." He gestured to Margaret. "One woman with a guitar showed us that community isn't about having fancy facilities or perfect circumstances. It's about people choosing to care for each other. Choosing to show up, choosing to be present." The crowd applauded, and Margaret felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment and pleasure. "So I talked to corporate," Carl continued, "and they've agreed to several improvements for the building. We're going to fix the broken playground equipment. We're going to repaint the exterior. We're going to approve Derek's proposal for a community garden. And we're going to hire a part-time community coordinator to help organize regular events like this one." The cheers that erupted were deafening. People hugged each other, laughed, cried. The promise of investment in their home felt like validation that they mattered, that their community was worth supporting. But Carl wasn't finished. "And after talking with some of the residents, we'd like to offer the community coordinator position to someone who's already proven she knows how to build community. Margaret Wilson, would you be willing to take on this role?" Margaret was stunned. She looked around at the faces of the people she had come to care for deeply over these past months. She saw Marcus grinning at her encouragingly. She saw Denise nodding with tears in her eyes. She saw Derek giving her a thumbs up. She saw Mrs. Chen clasping her hands together hopefully. "I'm 72 years old," Margaret said into the microphone Carl handed her. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for this." "You're exactly the right person," Derek called out. "You've already been doing the job. You might as well get paid for it." The crowd laughed and applauded their agreement. Margaret felt overwhelmed with gratitude and purpose. 6 months ago, she had felt like her life was ending, like she had nothing left to contribute. Now she was being offered a chance to make a real difference, to turn her daily concerts into something even more meaningful. "Then I accept," she said, her voice strong despite her emotions. "On one condition. This community belongs to all of us, not just me. I'll help coordinate, but I want everyone's input. This is our home, and we all get a say in how we shape it." The applause was her answer. As the evening deepened and the picnic began to wind down, Margaret found herself sitting on her usual bench with her guitar. A smaller group had gathered around her, the die-hard music lovers who wanted one more session before the night ended. She played softly, choosing songs about home and belonging, about finding your place in the world. Derek sat nearby, harmonizing on some of the choruses. Mr. Rodriguez added gentle trumpet accompaniment. Mrs. Chun hummed along, her granddaughter's head resting on her shoulder. Jason and Marcus sat together, the older brother's arm around the younger one's shoulders. Denise watched her sons with a peaceful expression Margaret had never seen on her face before. The worry line seemed less deep, the exhaustion less overwhelming. As Margaret transitioned into a lullaby, parents began gathering their sleepy children. People started cleaning up, working together to pack away tables and chairs, to gather trash, to restore the courtyard to its usual state while somehow leaving it transformed. Margaret's role as community coordinator officially began 2 weeks after the picnic. The position came with a small office in the building's ground floor, a room that had previously been used for storage. Derek led a team of volunteers to clean it out, paint the walls a cheerful yellow, and furnish it with donated items. Mrs. Chun contributed curtains she had sewn herself. Mr. Rodriguez built shelves for books and supplies. Jason and Marcus painted a mural on one wall showing the courtyard, filled with musical notes and people. The office became a hub for community activities. Margaret set up regular office hours where residents could drop by with ideas, concerns, or just to chat. She created a bulletin board where people could post notices about babysitting exchanges, tool lending, ride shares to the grocery store, and upcoming events. The sense of mutual support and cooperation continued to grow. One of Margaret's first initiatives was to establish a community mentorship program. She had seen how the relationship between her and Marcus had positively affected him, and she believed others could benefit from similar connections. She matched willing adults with young people who needed support, guidance, or just someone to talk to. Derek was paired with a quiet 14-year-old boy named Kevin, who was struggling in school and had few friends. Derek, remembering his own isolation, met with Kevin twice a week to help with homework and teach him basic programming skills. Kevin flourished under the attention, his grades improving and his confidence growing. Mrs. Chen started teaching Mandarin and Tai Chi to anyone interested. Her classes met 3 mornings a week in the courtyard, attracting a diverse group of students including some who had never exercised regularly before. The gentle movements and focus on breathing helped people manage stress and connected them to a practice with thousands of years of history. Mr. Rodriguez organized a community band that rehearsed every Tuesday evening. They weren't very good at first, a collection of amateur musicians playing mismatched instruments, but they improved with practice and genuine enjoyment. They performed at community events and even started getting invitations to play at other neighborhood gatherings. The community garden that Derek had proposed became a reality in early spring. The property management company provided seeds, soil, and basic tools. Residents claimed plots and began planting vegetables, herbs, and flowers. The garden became another gathering place where people worked side by side, sharing gardening knowledge and stories. Harold from 2D, the elderly man who rarely left his apartment, turned out to be an expert gardener. He spent hours in the community garden teaching others how to properly prepare soil, when to plant different crops, and how to manage pests naturally. His wife Ruth would bring him lemonade and sit in a folding chair, chatting with whoever was working nearby. Their isolation ended, replaced by purpose and connection. Jason completed his GED and enrolled in community college, studying music production. He had discovered a passion for recording and sound engineering, and Derek helped him set up a small home studio where he could practice and create. Jason started offering free recording sessions to local musicians, building a portfolio while contributing to the artistic life of the community. Marcus continued to write songs, and his music teacher at school helped him join the youth choir at the community center. His natural musical talent was being properly nurtured, and he dreamed of one day becoming a professional musician. Margaret made sure he understood that dreams required work, but that work was worth it. When you loved what you were doing, Denise's life transformed in quieter but equally significant ways. With Jason back on track and Marcus thriving, the constant worry that had defined her existence began to ease. Other mothers in the building helped with childcare when needed. When she was sick with the flu, neighbors brought soup and helped with laundry. She was no longer doing everything alone. The monthly community dinners became anticipated events. Each one had a theme, celebrating different cultures represented in the building. There was an Italian night, a soul food celebration, a Vietnamese feast, and a Mexican fiesta. People learned about each other's traditions and histories through food and stories. Breaking down stereotypes and building understanding. Margaret observed all these developments with quiet satisfaction, but she never took credit for any of it. When people thanked her for bringing the community together, she would always redirect the praise. "I just played some music," she would say. "You all did the hard work of opening your hearts and choosing to connect." But everyone knew that without Margaret's initial act of courage, sitting on those steps with her guitar despite her loneliness and grief, none of this would have happened. She had been the spark, even if the fire belonged to everyone. 6 months into her role as community coordinator, Margaret faced her first real challenge. The property management company announced they would be raising rents by 15% to cover the cost of the improvements they had made to the building. For many residents living paycheck to paycheck, this increase was potentially devastating. Panic spread through Riverside Apartments. People who had just started to feel stable and hopeful now faced the possibility of having to move, of losing the community they had built together. Several residents came to Margaret in tears, asking what they could do. Margaret had never been an activist or organizer in the political sense, but she knew she couldn't stand by while the community she loved was threatened. She called a meeting in the courtyard, and nearly every resident showed up. "I know you're scared," Margaret said, addressing the worried crowd. "I'm scared too. But we've already proven that when we work together, we can accomplish things we couldn't do alone. We need to show the management company that we're not just tenants. We're a community, and we have value." Garrick, who had experience with corporate negotiations from his previous career, helped organize their approach. They researched tenant rights, fair housing laws, and rent control ordinances. They compiled data showing that the sense of community had actually reduced costs for the management company through lower turnover, less vandalism, and fewer maintenance issues caused by neglect. Mrs. Chen suggested they document all the improvements residents had made to the property at their own expense. The garden, the mural, the ongoing maintenance of common areas all represented value that the residents had added without compensation. They invited local news media to cover their story. A reporter from the city newspaper came and interviewed residents, photographed the garden and the community spaces, and attended one of the morning concerts. The resulting article, titled "How Music Built a Community," went viral online, attracting attention from housing advocates and community organizers across the city. The publicity put pressure on the management company. They couldn't quietly raise rents on a building that had become a symbol of successful community building. After 2 weeks of negotiations led by Derek and supported by the entire community, they reached a compromise. The rent increase would be capped at 5%, with a commitment to review the rate again in 2 years. Additionally, the company agreed to establish a hardship fund to help residents who still couldn't afford the increase. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was fair, and it kept the community intact. More importantly, the experience of fighting together for their home had strengthened the bonds between residents. They had learned they could be powerful when they acted collectively, that their voices mattered, and that their community was worth fighting for. A year after Margaret first sat on the steps at Riverside Apartments with her guitar, the community decided to throw an anniversary celebration. They'd planned it for the same Saturday in May when they'd held their first picnic, wanting to mark how far they'd come and recommit to the values that had brought them together. The preparations were even more elaborate than the first picnic had been. The community garden was in full bloom, providing fresh vegetables and herbs for the feast. The community band had improved enough to play a full concert. Local businesses, impressed by the community's cohesion and positive reputation, donated supplies and services. But Margaret had something else on her mind as the anniversary approached. She had been diagnosed with a heart condition several months earlier. The doctors had assured her it was manageable with medication and lifestyle changes. But it was a reminder that she was 73 and wouldn't be around forever. She needed to ensure that the community could sustain itself without her. She began meeting individually with the people who had become informal leaders within Riverside Apartments. She talked to Derek about his gift for organization and strategic thinking. She encouraged Mrs. Chen to take on more responsibility for cultural programming. She helped Mr. Rodriguez develop a plan for the music program that could continue without her daily presence. She worked with Denise and several other parents to establish a formal youth activities committee. "What are you doing?" Derek asked her one afternoon, noticing the pattern of these conversations. It feels like you're preparing to leave. Margaret smiled gently. I'm preparing to step back eventually. I'm not leaving tomorrow, but I won't be here forever. This community needs to belong to everyone, not depend on one person, even me. Derek understood, though he didn't like thinking about Riverside Apartments without Margaret. A year ago I was hiding in my apartment, convinced I wanted to be alone. Now I can't imagine living any other way. You gave me my life back. You gave yourself your life back, Margaret corrected. I just played some music. You chose to listen, to engage, to become part of something bigger than yourself. That was all you. The anniversary celebration drew an even larger crowd than the first picnic. The mayor came, having heard about Riverside Apartments through the news coverage of the rent increase negotiations. Representatives from the Housing Authority attended, interested in understanding how they could encourage similar community building in other affordable housing complexes. The day was filled with performances, food, games, and speeches. Children who had barely known each other a year ago now played together constantly. Adults who had been strangers were now friends who supported each other through job losses, health crises, family problems, and everyday challenges. Margaret was invited to speak, to share her reflections on the year. She stood before the crowd with her guitar, feeling both proud and humbled by what she saw around her. When I moved here a year ago, she began, I was lonely and grieving. I had lost my husband, my home, my sense of purpose. I felt like my life was essentially over, like all the meaningful chapters had already been written. She paused, looking around at the faces of the people who had become her family. I started playing music in the courtyard because I needed comfort, because music was all I had left. I never imagined that such a simple act would lead to all of this. Marcus smiled at her from the front row, sitting between his brother and mother. Derek gave her an encouraging nod. Mrs. Chun had tears in her eyes. But here's what I've learned, Margaret continued. Community doesn't require grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It requires presence. It requires kindness. It requires the willingness to show up, to be vulnerable, to care about people beyond yourself. She strummed a few chords on her guitar. Music brought us together initially, but it's not music that keeps us together. It's the choice each of you makes every day to participate, to contribute, to look out for one another. It's the mom who babysits for her neighbor so she can go to a job interview. It's the teenager who helps an elderly resident carry groceries. It's the friend who listens when someone needs to talk. The crowd was completely silent, hanging on her words. This community belongs to all of you, Margaret said. I'm honored to have played a part in starting it. But the real credit goes to each person who chose to engage, who chose to care, who chose to believe that connection and community were possible even in the midst of difficulty and struggle. She began to play then, a song she had written specifically for this occasion. It was about home, about finding family in unexpected places, about the courage it takes to open your heart after it's been broken. As she sang, others joined in, harmonizing, adding their voices to create something beautiful together. After the formal program ended, and the celebration continued in a more casual way, Margaret found herself talking with the mayor and the housing authority representatives. They wanted to know if she would be willing to consult with other communities, to share what had worked at Riverside Apartments. I appreciate the offer, Margaret said. But I think you're asking the wrong question. You're asking what I did, when you should be asking what conditions allowed community to form organically. She gestured around the courtyard. You need shared spaces where people can gather informally. You need affordability so people aren't constantly worried about losing their homes. You need diversity, people from different backgrounds bringing different strengths. And you need time. Community can't be rushed or forced. It has to grow naturally. The mayor was writing notes. So how do we replicate this? You don't, Margaret said simply. Every community is unique, but you can create conditions that make community more likely. Invest in common areas. Support community coordinators. Encourage resident-led activities. Trust people to know what they need and give them resources to make it happen. As evening fell and the lights came on in the courtyard, the anniversary celebration evolved into a dance party. The community band played and people of all ages danced together. Little children held hands with grandparents. Teenagers showed off their moves. Parents swayed with babies in their arms. Margaret sat on her bench, content to watch rather than participate in the dancing. Derek came and sat beside her. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not giving up on me even when I was a jerk. For not giving up on any of us." "I didn't do anything special," Margaret protested. "You did the most special thing possible," Derek countered. "You showed up. Day after day, you showed up and shared beauty with people who desperately needed it. That's not nothing. That's everything." Later that night, after the celebration had ended and the courtyard was quiet again, Margaret stood in the spot where she had first sat with her guitar a year ago. So much had changed. The building looked better, yes, but more importantly, it felt different. It felt alive with possibility and connection. She thought about her husband, about how much she would have loved seeing what had grown from her simple morning concerts. She thought about the loneliness she had felt when she first moved here, and how that loneliness had transformed into purpose. The next morning, Margaret took her usual spot on the bench at 8 o'clock. Marcus arrived first, as always, followed by Derek with coffee. Mrs. Chun appeared with her folding chair. Mr. Rodriguez had his trumpet. Others drifted over, taking their customary places in the growing circle. Margaret began to play a new song she was working on. The notes floated through the morning air, weaving between the buildings, reaching into apartments where people were just waking up. Some would come down to listen. Others would just open their windows and let the music in. It was a simple tune, nothing fancy or complicated. But it was played with love for people who had become family in a place that had become home. And, in its simplicity, it contained everything that mattered: connection, hope, and the transformative power of showing up with an open heart. The community at Riverside Apartments would face more challenges in the years to come. People would move away and new people would arrive. There would be conflicts and disappointments, successes and failures. But the foundation had been laid, the culture established. They knew now that they could be more than just neighbors sharing a building. They could be a community, supporting and enriching each other's lives, and it had all started with one woman, a guitar, and a simple tune played on a quiet morning. Not because the music itself was magical, but because it created space for people to gather, to see each other, to recognize their shared humanity. Margaret had offered a gift, and the community had unwrapped it together. Finding not just music but connection, not just notes but hope. Not just sound but the beginning of something beautiful that would ripple outward far beyond the walls of Riverside Apartments. Touching lives in ways Margaret would never fully know but could feel in her heart every time she played.